Can I wear Nenad's hat?
Sure. I should have done it. And upstairs too. But the thing is that I have a camera as well. Little camera, so we'll take a few photos.
You like that hole in the wall?
Yes.
We had visitors here one time, soon after we moved in. And they said, oh, isn't that nice? I said, yeah, I don't know why they left a hole in the wall. We're going to fill that in, finish the wall. And they said, oh, no, that looks very nice. You see, there's 2 stories to that side of the house. And there's only 1 story here. This is the...
Okay. There are also pictures of cousin that fought Pancho Villa, yeah. So I'll make everything simple, but it won't be. And again, we'll get to the major part because you will be writing and you'll be filming and then everything because once you start that, that will take a long time.
Put on a tie or a jacket?
Whatever you want. Whatever you want. If you feel comfortable like this, this is fine with me. What we do this will be mostly for your family, for your family and friends. And
very nice, yeah.
Yeah. And just to have some, this. I filmed my mother, and she died 2 years ago. That 10 years ago I filmed her.
So you have that for the children?
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah. Like my mother had a beautiful voice, and I always wish we had recorded it.
And it's today only. Yeah. So. So you can see all of them. And a microphone.
But that's for Alexander, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The Order of St. Maur, M-A-U-R. And then John's mother was decorated for her service during the Irish troubles.
Wow, that's your wife's mother. Hungnam.
And this is John's sister.
Mm-hmm.
She is the epidemiologist.
Mm-hmm.
She just retired from the Centers for Disease Control.
Mm-hmm.
You know that bottle of wine, you know that?
Yeah,
That's your picture.
Correct.
Juliana brought that but we're waiting for a special occasion.
Yeah.
It's very expensive.
Yes, it is. For us it is, yeah. We drink cheap wine.
Yeah. You know, when you mentioned that it's a church like, you know, we call that type of room a room with a cathedral ceiling.
Cathedral ceiling. Yeah, you are right. Cathedral, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah.
We have one cathedral ceiling in our home as well.
Very nice.
Yeah.
And when we walked into this house and we looked,
Yeah.
as soon as we stepped in, we said, "This is."
Yeah, that's the one.
We didn't tell the broker we liked it very much. We don't know what to think about it. As soon as they know you like it.
Correct. The price goes up. Price goes up.
See, in this part of the house is 2 floors. Yeah. So we have the 4 bedrooms, 2, 3, 4 upstairs. Away with these guys from the old country. They were trained in the old country.
Yeah.
And I don't know where.
Yeah. That's history or?
Yeah, I think so. Janino and Paul.
I want to say.
Okay, sit down.
You're on.
So we're rolling. So Mr. Lunney, tell us your name, full name, and spell it, please.
I was christened James Robert Lunney, Lunney, and I use the name J. Robert Lunney today because I never knew my first name was James until later on at school. My mother advised me that there was great concern when I was born in that my mother wanted the name Robert and my father wanted the name James. And so my older brother, who was 2 years old at the time, drew the names out of a hat. And my father and mother agreed that the first name he drew out would be the way I would be christened. He drew out James first. So I was christened James Robert. And my mother said, that's fine, but we will call him Robert. So today I use the initial J Robert Lunney.
And when and where were you born?
I was born on December 15, 1927 in Bronx, which is a borough of New York City.
Mm-hmm. And what was the name of your mother, father, and grandmother and grandfathers?
My father was Thomas J. Lunney, and my mother was Jessie Lunney, and her maiden name was Butcher, mm-hmm. Jessie M. Butcher. Mm-hmm. And my father was born in 1897, and my mother was born in 1903, and they were born in New York City in what is now known as Harlem.
Yeah. Do you remember your grandparents?
No, I just remember one grandparent who was alive when I was born, and that was my father's mother, and she was Cecilia Malie Lunney, and she died in 1938 at about 60 or 65 years old.
Mm-hmm. And how many brothers and sisters do you have?
I have two brothers. My older brother, Thomas, was born on January 1st, 1926, and I had a younger brother, David, who was born on December 25th, 1931.
Mm-hmm. And how many children do you have?
We have one child. I married Joan Margaret Guinan, a girl from Brooklyn, and I believe we were married on July 10th, 1976, and November 4th, 1978, Alexander was born. So we are very happy parents of one child, a fine son, Alexander.
Okay.
Tell me a little bit about your childhood and fond memories you have, and the things that motivated you and inspired you in your early life.
Our early childhood, of course, was growing up in the Bronx, and as I reflect back at those times, it was during the Depression, and little did we know that the world was under Great Depression economically at that time. So our childhood was somewhat limited in that we all went through the public school system in New York City, and I went to public school 89 in the Bronx, and then went to Christopher Columbus High School after that. And my father was in the real estate and insurance business, and he had his own office, and my mother was basically a housekeeper. And later on during the war, 1941, she became a executive secretary in the what they called the selective service system, which was the draft during the war. And so she worked throughout the war of 1941 through 1946 as an executive secretary with the selective service system in New York City. My father had been in the Navy in World War I, and he served in the U.S. Navy submarine service out of New London, Connecticut. And it was his portrait over our bedroom that always inspired me as a child to think about the Navy. And there was a large photo of himself and his two cousins who served together in the Navy in World War One. And that portrait was always a fond memory of my father's service and an inspiration for my older brother and myself when the World War II came to join the Navy.
How did you join the Navy? Was it a volunteer? Was it a draft at that time?
During the war, that is during World War II, the Navy allowed enlistments of young men who had reached their 17th birthday, providing they had the authority of their parents. And my older brother had joined the Navy when he was about 17, and he was 2 years older than me, and I was very anxious to do my duty and to do my service, especially with the Navy. So during my last year of high school, and that would be 1945, I prevailed upon my father to give me permission to enlist in the Navy. And on May 1st, 1945, I enlisted in the United States Navy.
So that was at the age of 18?
No, I was 17 years old and about 4 months.
I see, okay.
I apologize, I would rather pause and just check that we have audio. I want to be sure.
Okay.
We should try it earlier, but...
So what was it like for a young man of 17 to have his first experiences on a Navy ship?
Well, we first had our training in upstate New York, in Sampson, New York, and it was about 11 or 12 weeks of training. And then we were granted 1 week leave. And at that time it was the summer of 1945, and the war was ending. However, after our 1 week leave, we were, that is my entire company, perhaps 240 men, was sent direct to the Pacific. We were and trained from Sampson, New York to San Pedro, California. And San Pedro, California, we were placed aboard a Navy transport, and that transport carried us to first Pearl Harbor, and that is where I first viewed many of the ships that had been sunk during the attack by the Japanese on December 7, 1941, including the USS Utah. Several hundred of the men were disembarked at Pearl Harbor for continued service with the Navy there. However, the rest of us were then transported first to Johnson Island, I remember, where we, I think, took on water, perhaps fuel, but mostly water. Then to the Marshall Islands, Eniwetok and Kwajalein. I believe some men were disembarked there. And eventually we sailed on to the Mariana Islands, which included the island of Saipan. And we were disembarked there. And myself, together with several hundred other men, were disembarked at Saipan. And on Saipan, I was first assigned to an office, which I remember very vividly, because to me, I wanted to be sailing in the Navy, and I prevailed upon the commanding officer to reassign me to one of the ships in the harbor, and he was very instrumental in understanding what I wanted. And the next morning, I was very happy chipping paint on a landing craft. I was assigned to what they called an LCI, the LCI L 371. LCI is Landing Craft Infantry, and the L stood for large, and the number of the ship was 371. And we were a typical amphibious craft. We carried usually a rifle company of about 150 men, either soldiers or Marines. And the next morning, this would have been in September or October 1945, we were engaged in the surrender and occupation of many of the Japanese bypassed islands. You see, the MacArthur strategy was to leapfrog across the Pacific. In many cases, islands were captured and taken after great effort, such as Saipan and then Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But between those island groups were other Japanese-held islands where they were left, in a sense, to wither on the vine because the Japanese could not supply them. They could not refurbish any of their equipment. And we went to those islands and in many cases accepted the surrender of those Japanese and brought in supplies and equipment to feed them because in many cases they had no food. And we carried, as I say, a rifle company, either Marines or soldiers, to each of those islands. During my tour on the landing craft, the LCI 371, we went to Marcus Island. We made several trips to Marcus Island, which was sovereign to Japan before the war. And we went to Iwo Jima. We brought up a rifle company and brought Marines back to Saipan. We went up into the Northern Marianas. The Northern Marianas had 5 or 6 different islands which were surrendered, and we brought in Marines and soldiers during that occupation of those islands. And later on I was transferred to other ships. The LCI that I was on, the landing craft I was on, later was ordered back to the United States, and I was reassigned to an attack transport out of Pearl Harbor. And what is interesting about that ship was the USS Carlisle, APA 69, and we prepared that ship for the July 1st, 1946 atomic bomb test. That was the test where the atomic bomb was to be dropped from an airplane at an island in the Marshall Group called Bikini. And my ship, the USS Carlisle, was one of the first ships sunk in that atomic bomb test. The USS Carlisle, APA 69, now lies in the lagoon sunken at Bikini Island. After that, we were assigned to a YTB, a tug that was assigned to China, and we sailed that tugboat from Pearl Harbor through the Marshall Islands and then to Guam. And at Guam, it was in the summer of 1946 when we were transported back to Treasure Island in San Francisco, and thence by train to Lido Beach in New York. We were all separated from the Navy.
What was going through your mind at that time as you passed through Pearl Harbor, as you went to the different Japanese islands on the various amphibious craft?
The impression I always recall of sailing through Pearl Harbor was, of course, the devastation experienced by the fleet during the Japanese attack, because many of the ships that were not salvaged were still in the harbor sunk, especially the Arizona, and we could see the Utah as well. And it was quite impressive to us, having read about it, having heard about it, but then to see it, it was somewhat emotional when later on we realized that many men were still entombed in these ships. The Arizona especially had, I believe, over 1,200 men still entombed. We had no idea of the men that were still in the Utah. Only years later did I realize that the Utah had 58 men still entombed in the sunken hull at that time.
Did you also have at that time a sense of history, culture and economic position of different countries in the world? For example, that of the US versus Japan or some other country in that region?
I guess as a young man growing up in America, we had great faith and confidence in our government we, in a sense, believed what our government officials told us, etc. I had a good sense of geography because as a child my parents developed a great interest in stamps and stamp collection, so that even as a child I grew to understand the geography of the world. And many of my colleagues didn't have that understanding, and as I look back now, I think I achieved that understanding of geography and other interests of the world through collecting stamps and knowing and trying to learn as much as I could about various geographical elements of the world. We, of course, were brought up at that time, during the war, with the idea that we were fighting a good and just war, and it was fair of us to engage with the Japanese. So we were very much enthused and encouraged to participate in this great campaign to defeat Japan especially. Of course, we all learned about the European war, but we were sent, especially because of the Navy, with the Pacific War. So most of my interest and understanding was vis-a-vis the Japanese.
How long does it take to sail from Pearl Harbor to Marshall Islands, for example?
Oh, the trip from Pearl Harbor to the Marshall Islands, having stopped at Johnson Island for water, we would always stop there for water, was several days. But then the trip from the Marshall Islands to the Mariana Islands would perhaps take 5 or 6 days, because that was a longer trip.
Yeah. And how did you, do you remember nights there, or like, do you see the sky, or what do you remember, like salt, or how did you spend time for 3 days on the Pacific, for example, traveling like that? What do you remember?
On the trip out, you must understand that we were sailing in a Navy transport which probably had over 5,000 men in it, and we were assigned to compartments in the ship, and I recall sleeping 6 or 7 tiers high with bunks and what we would call in the Navy racks that could fold up or canvas, and we would have to put our sea bags in there and sleep in there, so that it was very crowded conditions. We were young at the time and we adapted probably fairly easily. Today I'm not sure I would feel too comfortable in that situation, but I recall just the fascination of sailing. I always wanted to be part of an adventure, so to speak, and sailing and ships to me, having grown up in a great seaport like New York, was to me something I would have thought of or dreamed of or hoped for, so that sailing aboard a ship to me was a great adventure, a great inspiration, and I really enjoyed the sea and ships, so that I was quite content and happy, albeit it was very crowded conditions. The food was not very good. Sleeping accommodations were very bad, but to me it was a great adventure, and I felt proud of serving in the United States Navy.
Yeah. Did you see the southern sky, like Southern Cross and things like that?
Well, at that time I didn't have a great knowledge of celestial navigation, but the thing that always impressed me was the phosphorus wake of the ship at night, when if you stood on the fantail of the ship and the churning of the propeller, or as we would call it, the screw of the ship, would churn up this great wake behind us, and at night you could see the phosphorus elements of the sea. And many times, if we were within close proximity to islands, you would have birds coming out, and in those days, whether it was environmentally correct or not, we would dump all of the garbage and all of the waste of the ship, and the birds would come from the nearby islands if we were close enough. It was always surprising to me to see birds many miles out from the nearest point of land. And so that I did get a great impression of the sea, the phosphorescent wake, the birds, and the combination of the sea and the sky. And to me it was a fantastic opportunity as a young man at 17 to be...
How far are you away on the Bikini Islands when they tested the bomb?
Oh, we were separated from the ship at Pearl Harbor before the ship sailed to the Bikini Atoll.
Which takes how long from...
that would take just a couple of days down to the Marshall Islands. And they put a skeleton crew on and then removed that crew, of course, before the bomb was dropped. Incidentally, the bomb was misplaced. It never did hit the target. What I read about afterwards, it was called Operation Crossroads, was the bomb actually hit very close to my ship, the USS Carlisle, which was immediately destroyed and sunk because the airplane that was to drop the bomb probably missed the target, and the target was not our ship, but that's what occurred at the time.
I wanted to just touch upon the fact that it sounds like it was in your nature to be in the heart, that you wanted to be kind of in the heart of the action. By that I mean, when you joined the Navy, you wanted to sail. You didn't want to be in some dock doing some. So I'm sure that's part of your nature, that you're very action-oriented.
Oh, I believe so. In that I would never have wanted to participate on behalf of my country in some office or some land-based activity. To me, the service was to be accomplished, and my personal desire was to be involved as much as I could, so that I had a very strong desire to be aboard a ship and to see as much action as I could.
I understand you had numerous promotions. How does that process happen, and what does it take to get promoted? Is it I'm sure, or at least I hope it's not really a political process, but it's based on merit. Is that correct?
Well, essentially, most promotions or appointments in the United States Navy, as in all of the other armed forces, is based on merit. In my case, that selection process was done by your commanding officer when you were in the enlisted ranks, that is, the non-commissioned ranks, and you would be tested and qualified, and after certain periods of time you were eligible for advancement, and if your commanding officer, in his discretion, saw you as a potential candidate for promotion, you received your promotion. When the Korean War began, I had already achieved my baccalaureate degree. I had graduated college on June 12th, 1950 from Alfred University, which I attended on what they call the GI Bill of Rights, so that when the Korean War began, I had prior naval service, and with a baccalaureate degree, I was eligible for a commission as an officer in the Navy. And in that case, you were well qualified if you passed the physical examination and you had the proper academic credentials and prior naval service. And thus, I was appointed as an ensign, which is the lowest commissioned rank in the Navy, during the Korean War.
What was the most difficult part of serving in the military for you?
Probably only in reflection, looking back, and at the time you were young enough to adjust fairly well, but in reflection, I thought that sometimes the leadership lacked quality and perhaps were not entirely frank and honest with the men that they were leading. And that at times, when I look back, was somewhat disappointing. I once thought of making the Navy my full-time career. And when I realized that there were some flaws in the leadership qualities in the Navy or the military, I chose that maybe to stay in the reserve was good and serve my country as needed during an emergency or during war, but not to make a professional career out of it. I must reflect on the fact that my observations of flaws in leadership wasn't necessarily limited to the Navy. I have found that to be true in the course of life too.
Right.
So that I guess it's the frailty of human beings wherever they are, that at times you're disappointed in leadership. And
Who are some of your heroes and why, just in general, in the military and out?
well,
Or people that you admire for their service or some other aspect of their life?
well, of course, on my mother's side, my ancestors have been here for many hundreds of years. They served in the American Revolution and the colonial wars and the French and Indian wars before that. So that as I reflect back on that side of my ancestry, George Washington to me was a great leader for many reasons, not only eventually a great military leader, but a man of unquestioned integrity and leadership qualities in running the country and being our first president. So in my mind, George Washington was one of my true heroes and a true hero of America as well.
Some other ones?
Well, it's hard to discern. My only hero was a professor I had in college who took a particular interest in me and my career, and he sought me out and strongly encouraged me to go on to graduate school and professional school. He was going on for his doctorate at Cornell University and strongly suggested to me that I apply for the Cornell Law School. And he was truly a turning point in my life because no one had really ever taken much interest in me. Whatever success I had was because of my own personal endeavor. And yes, you had a lot of help from family, parents, etc. But this was a professor
What was his name?
recognized me as a person and showed great interest in me and my future. So I always look back at him as one of my mentors and great influence on my life.
What was his name?
I'm trying to remember his name now. He was my professor of history and political science, and was at Alfred University. And he went on for his doctorate at the Cornell University. And unfortunately, on June 1950, when I graduated college, the Korean War broke out on June 25th, 1950. And because I had sailed in the Merchant Marine during 1947, 1948, to earn money for college, because my GI Bill was not paying for everything, I used to sail every summer in the Merchant Marine aboard merchant ships, and I sailed that summer aboard the SS Meredith Victory. When the war began, the steamship company called me, and they flew us, that is 35 men and 12 officers, from New York to Norfolk, Virginia. And we took a ship out of what they call the laid-up fleet, the mothball fleet in the James River, and we sailed by expedited transit through the Panama Canal to, I believe it was Oakland, California, and we loaded Army cargo, and that would have been in, we sailed out of Norfolk, Virginia on July 28th, 1950, and thence to the Panama Canal to Oakland, California, from Oakland, California to Yokohama, Japan, and thence offloaded, and then were combat loaded under sealed orders, and which we opened at sea, and realized that our orders were to take the ship with the Army cargo direct to Incheon. And we carried all of the tanks, equipment, and ammunition for part of a regimental combat team and landed at Incheon, which is on the west coast of Korea, which was a very dramatic amphibious landing engineered by General MacArthur. And he was given great credit for his genius in landing a substantial number of UN troops, mostly American, behind enemy lines at Incheon. And thus, by participating in the Korean War, I was unable to attend the Cornell Law School until a year later. I was to begin in September 15th, 1950, and on September 15th, 1950, we were landing part of a regimental combat team from the 7th Infantry Division at Incheon under enemy fire, and we had suffered only one enemy air attack at that time, and so we were successful in participating in that landing, and thence we continued transporting troops, cargo, ammunition, tanks to and from Japan to various ports in Korea, from Yokohama and Tokyo to ports like Incheon again and Busan and into North Korea and places like that during the Korean War from 1950 to 1951.
What were your impressions of the Korean War while you were there? I guess that's not a good question.
I have one question in the meantime, if you don't mind. Which kind of movies did you watch? What did you read at that time? Like when you were 17, or did you go to the movies before and after? Did you follow any of this, like music-wise, literature? What did you do? Do you remember anything from that time?
Aboard the merchant ship like this, we only had 35 men and 12 officers. We had no access to movies, literature, newspapers,
radio.
Very limited radio, because at that time, as compared to today, radios were not as extant nor as easily available, so that the most that we had was a small library or whatever books we brought aboard, but we all had access to what you would call Victrolas, or hand-operated machines to play records. Some of the crew had machines that could be plugged into the electricity, but mostly the old 78 RPM records. But we mostly listened to very classical music, mostly operas like Dvorak's. I always remember Dvorak's New World Symphony. We had limited access, so many times we would be playing records over and over again, and we would all exchange books. I would rarely, and to this day, don't read many novels. I always loved history books and military books and seagoing books of instruction, etc. I always liked to learn something, and thus we would pass around books like this. But I always remember, pasted on the bulkhead of my cabin was a huge chart, and I would trace all of the voyages that we took and indicate the dates and the times and the places where we went, because I was very, very interested in geography and where we were going and what we were doing and then what seas we were going through. And it was quite exciting to me because, for example, if we sailed from Yokohama to Japan, we would go down and through the inland sea and off to Korea in that way. And when we were ordered up into North Korea to support what they call now the Chosin Reservoir Campaign, we were given expedited orders to carry 10,000 tons of jet fuel in drums. You're familiar with the 50-gallon drums, and we carried 10,000. The ship was fully loaded with jet fuel, and we carried that from Tokyo through the inland sea and up to North Korea to supply an airport from which the Marine Corps was flying their planes in support of the Chosin Reservoir Campaign. And we got into North Korea at the port of Hungnam, and we had to transit through the minefield and
with the jet fuel.
With the jet fuel, and we were met in the outer harbor with the minesweeper, and we were all under radio silence, so the minesweeper was able to shoot over the charts, got close enough to give us the charts through the swept channels of the minefield to get into the inner harbor. And I always remember the minesweeper requested that we maintain 2,500 yards behind the sweeper as it would take us through the charted course. And we realized after they inquired as to what we were carrying that they were getting farther and farther ahead of us, and it was very difficult for us to maintain 2,500 yards until we realized they didn't want to be very close to us. And to us, we were somewhat used to what we were carrying, and we never expressed too much concern. We realized that it was a very, I guess if you thought about it, inflammable cargo, and if we hit a mine it would probably be devastating. But we got through the minefield and into the inner harbor, and through our binoculars we could see the Chinese communists were closing rapidly on the port. At that time the Chinese had intervened during the Korean War with perhaps 300,000 of them crossing the Yalu River, coming across the top of Korea, and the Chosin Reservoir Campaign, which was spearheaded by the 1st Marine Division with elements of the 7th Infantry Division, were hit hard by what they estimate to be about 120,000 Chinese troops, which forced them back to the sea. And we could see through our binoculars the Chinese were overrunning, giving great enemy pressure to the airfield that we were to supply. So then we were ordered out, back through the minefield, south to Pusan. We were ordered to offload the cargo, but before we could completely offload the cargo, with 300 tons of jet fuel still in the number 3 hold, we were ordered back north to Hungnam, because the Chinese were moving more rapidly than expected, and the entire port was surrounded, and they needed every available ship to take out as much of the equipment and men as possible. So we had to go back north through the minefield again, still carrying about 300 tons of jet fuel, into the inner harbor, and thence the captain was asked, because they could not order him, I remember, they requested he gather his officers together, and the 12 officers met with the army personnel who described the situation and the circumstances surrounding the port, and how orders had been given that we were now, that is the UN forces, were to start evacuating the civilian population, which was crowded on the beach, thousands upon thousands of North Korean civilians, mostly older men, women and children, were crowded on the beach. It was one of the coldest winters recorded that century in Korea. This port was aflame from enemy gunfire. Most of the Marine Division had been evacuated. Most of the 7th Infantry Division had been evacuated. The 3rd Infantry Division now was holding the perimeter, which was collapsing rapidly. So much so that when the captain did agree to take our ship into the beach to embark the civilian refugees, the perimeter then was within thousands of yards. It was not miles, it was 5,000 yards or 4,000 yards, so that the perimeter was closing rapidly on the port, and the military decided, because the civilians had been threatened with annihilation by the communists, as they came down to the sea, the communists were annihilating all of the civilian population that they came across because they accused them of cooperating with the UN forces. So every village they came through, they would annihilate as many as they could because they accused them of working.
So these are the Chinese and the Korean.
North Koreans,
North
yes.
Koreans.
Were annihilating these North Korean civilians. So they were fleeing south, and their only access to freedom was the sea. So they crowded by the thousands to the port of Hungnam. And my captain volunteered to take the ship in, and he told the army that he would take on as many as he could. And this was like December 22nd, 1950. We commenced loading the civilians on the ship. We loaded them like cargo. We had no passenger space. We loaded them in each of the holds, in the tween decks, and put in the layers as we would with cargo, and leaving some hatch openings for air. The people came aboard. We had no food, and no water, no electricity, no heat, no doctor, no interpreter. And we loaded them into these holds of a regular cargo ship until the captain counted 14,000 people in the ship. And we took off the last of the people that we could see on the beach. And by this time, the perimeter was closing down maybe 3,000 to 4,000 yards. The military were taking casualties on the perimeter all during this time. And we had men on the shore with axes to chop the lines in case the enemy broke through. The communists were fighting fiercely to capture the entire city, but the UN forces, mostly American of course, were evacuating as much as they could in the way of equipment and tanks and men as possible. And we were able to load everyone that we saw, and thence transited the minefield again out into the open sea, and that would have been, I believe, December 23rd, 1950, and we were transporting all of these refugees south to Busan. That would take about a day transport down the entire east coast of Korea to Busan. And we got to Busan on December 24th, 1950. And within the biblical context, there was no room at the inn in Busan because of the Chinese incursion. The UN forces, again mostly American, were retreating all the way south again into what they call the Busan perimeter, which is down the southeast corner of Korea. And there was no room to disembark these refugees. So they ordered us southwest about 38 miles from Busan to an island called Kojido. And there we disembarked the refugees in the middle of winter. In the meanwhile, 5 babies were born. Many of the women were able to assist the birth of these children, babies. We had no doctor, and none of us knew how to.
So this was on a merchant ship?
Merchant ship, yes. Yeah. But at all times, we were chartered to the Military Sea Transportation Service, MSTS, And at all times we were sailing under Navy orders, under a Navy task force, so that we were under operational orders of the Navy during our whole transit in the Korean War. And thus we were able to operate in that fashion.
That was a Guinness, entered the Guinness Book of Records, that event?
Oh, the ship was later recognized not only by the Korean government. President Syngman Rhee decorated the officers and the men with the Korean Presidential Unit Citation. They gave one of their highest medals to our captain, Captain Leonard P. LaRue. The United States government, by special act of Congress, decorated the officers and the men with what they call the Gallant Ship Unit Citation. And later on, the Guinness World Records recognized the ship as the greatest rescue by a single ship in the history of the world.
And in which capacity were you sailing?
Well, I was the staff officer aboard the ship, and my job entailed all of the ship's business, the financial aspects of the ship, the entering and the clearing of the ship, the ship's manifests, logbooks, etc. In other words, the business of the ship.
We can say, looking at your history, that you, in a sense, have had four careers. One is the military career. You have the law career. You have the public service career, and then you have the family career. Can you sum up your military career? What some personal traits you have built from that? What did you take away from that career?
I spent almost 43 years on active and reserve duty with the United States Navy, from the age of 17 until the age of 60. And I guess, in looking back on that entire career of active duty and reserve duty, there were probably two elements, I would imagine, that were enlightening and probably part of my characteristics today. And one of those was leadership. We were well trained in leadership and knowing what our jobs were. And the second element was teamwork, working with people, because one of the elements of sailing aboard a ship was that the officers and crew were self-contained. The usual admonition was one hand for yourself, one hand for the ship. We all had our duties and functions, no matter what the exigencies were, and we had our orders fulfilled by a command structure that was well placed, so that we knew that we were not going ashore as you would if you were flying an airplane and then going to an old club or to a movie. We were aboard a ship, and that ship was our life and our family. And the devotion we had to each other was such that we had great respect for one another and what our duties and functions were, and we knew the definition of the duty and function of every man, no matter what the exigency would be, because it was very important for the welfare of the ship and the survival of the ship, whether it was through weather, enemy action, or just simply navigation. And I remember, no matter where we went, that there was a certain collegiality or comradeship with most seamen, whether they were foreigners or otherwise. If we sailed and were tied up near another ship, we would relate to, or of course, being sailors, we would go ashore and have a good drink after a trip, and we rather enjoyed that. And we enjoyed the company of sailors and people who served aboard ship, because to us that was a very special thing, because many of us had endured the weather and transit and all of the other experiences of seamanship, and many of us had that bonding, especially if we served during wartime aboard a ship. It was a very quiet understanding and respect for each other, which in a sense was unsaid many times, but you knew he had been there and he served, and to us that was something we each respected each other for.
Well, that's one of the traits that allows great things to be built, societies to be built, this kind of camaraderie and hard work. I wanted to ask you about law and your studies in law and your impressions of it.
We have 4 minutes now, and then we'll change the tape.
What made you choose law?
Well, it was the inspiration of my mentor in college, who said that he thought I would do well in studying law. My father, in the meanwhile, had been appointed by President Eisenhower, I believe in 1953, as the United States Marshal for the Southern District of New York, which was a presidential appointment with the advice and consent of the Senate. So my father was the chief law enforcement officer for this district on behalf of the federal government. And when I graduated from the Cornell Law School in 1954, I spoke to him, and he inquired as to the opportunity for me to be a federal prosecutor with the United States Attorney for this area. And on graduating law school, I was soon appointed as an assistant U.S. attorney with the Department of Justice here in New York, where I served for 5 years as a federal prosecutor, prosecuting different federal crimes, especially narcotics. I was involved in a lot of narcotic prosecution and other federal crimes, and that to me was a great experience. And I served there from 1955 till the end of 1959, and thence was appointed as an associate at a very large law firm called Sherman & Sterling in New York, where I engaged in the specialty of litigation, that is trial work, with a very large law firm, which involved many commercial type cases.
Like, for example?
We represented large banks, brokerage houses, and large corporations in any litigation, mostly federal antitrust litigation and contract litigation, and compliance with government subpoenas and associated matters such as that. And I stayed there until 1968, from approximately 1960 to 1968, and then established my own law firm, and I've been practicing pretty much on my own since then. And about this time I'm trying to wind down. My wife is strongly encouraging me to go places and do things. She, having retired from the... do you have other partners or other lawyers working for you? Not now. Up until about 3 years ago, I had a firm. At times we had 7 or 8 lawyers, mostly engaged in litigation, but we were cutting back And over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been trying to wind down, getting to the office a little later in the morning and coming home a little earlier in the afternoon. So my wife is strongly encouraging me to get out and do things and travel and go places and enjoy life. She said, we grew up under that tradition, having been children of the Depression. You work and you save. And we realized you work and you save, but today you've got to realize you've got to go out and do things and spend it and not necessarily leave it for someone else.
Right, because if you don't spend it, some Alexander will.
Right.
He's a good young
Yeah.
man.
Yeah. So we'll change the tape. Yeah. Yeah. So how do I stop or just press?
Press the red button.